All right, so we're starting with letter D, the trachea, in your outline. The trachea is a connection between the larynx and the primary bronchi. So the primary bronchi are the initial airways into the lungs. The trachea is also called your windpipe, but if you ever get a chance to answer questions on an exam or a quiz, you want to use the word trachea. So it's a pathway for air that leads into your lungs. You can see that it's held open by cartilage. So there's 16 to 20 cartilaginous rings called tracheal cartilages. And actually, they're not complete rings. Let's take a look at another image of this. So the tracheal cartilages are shaped like the letter C. They are open in the posterior trachea. And the reason is the trachea is your anterior structure, and the cartilaginous rings, these tracheal cartilages, I'm sorry, I keep saying rings, it's the letter C. And it holds the trachea open so that even when you're unconscious, you have an open pathway for air. It's only going to be obstructed if you accidentally swallow some food, right? If you, or not swallow food, but if this food goes down your trachea, then that will be blocked. But this is held open for air. Your esophagus is different. Your esophagus, which is directly behind your trachea, is collapsed most of the time. It's a thicker muscular tube, and it only opens up to expand when you swallow the food. So when you're physically swallowing, the esophagus is going to expand. It cannot expand posteriorly because look what is right behind your esophagus. It's your vertebrae, right? So this is a hard structure. It's not going to allow any expansion. So the esophagus expands forward into that little space of the posterior trachea. So that's why those cartilaginous rings don't go all the way around. They are shaped like the letter C to allow the esophagus to expand forward during swallowing. All right, so let's take a look at the other structures here. All right, so the ligaments that are found between those cartilaginous structures are annular ligaments. And the entire trachea is lined with respiratory epithelium, which is again that ciliated pseudostratified columnar cells with goblet cells. And then the trachea ends at a point called the carina. The carina is an internal ridge. So there's actually a little upward projection here, and it's going to mark the beginning of our two primary bronchi. Okay. Now let's talk about the primary bronchi. So the letter E, the bronchial tree. The three large initial segments of the bronchial tree are called primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, or tertiary bronchi, just for their first, second, and third split. You can also call them main bronchi, lobar bronchi, and segmental bronchi. And that's a little bit more descriptive. So if we start with number one, the right and left main bronchi, you have two lungs, the right and left lung. So the main bronchi will lead to those lungs. So you only have one left, or one right and one left main bronchi. Now I want you to take a look at the two main bronchi here and how they're illustrated. Are they exactly the same? Are they symmetrical? And the answer is no, they are not. They're slightly different from each other. The right side is shorter and straighter, right? So this little segment here is shorter in length and also a little bit straighter. Doesn't bifurcate at such an angle. It's a very small difference, but the left side is a little longer and it has a little bit more of an angle. So if you were to inhale objects, the path of least resistance, the path that's more direct, would lead to the right lung. So when you are breathing particulates and pollution through all your years of life, it tends that the heavier particulates or the pollution goes into the right lung more easily. And so because of this, lung cancers tend to be right lung cancers because it kind of gets more of those particulates, the heavier particulates in there. All right, so let's take a look at this. So here's our main bronchi again. So this is color coded for you. The second split is called lobar, and that makes sense because the next pathway will go to each lobe. So here we see the right lung has three lobes. It has a superior lobe, so we have a superior right secondary bronchus or lobar bronchus. Then we have a middle lobe. So we're going to have a right middle bronchus, and then we're going to have an inferior lobe, So we're going to have a right inferior a lobar bronchus, okay? So and in the left lung, you only have two lobes on the left lung. The left lung has a superior lobe, so you're going to have a superior lobar bronchus on the left side, and then just an inferior lobar bronchus. So the right lung has three lobar bronchi, a superior, a middle, and inferior. The left lung only has two lobar bronchi because there's only two lobes, right? A superior and an inferior. To find these on this structure, right? So they're going to be called secondary in this image, right? So we have a superior lobar, there it is, going to the superior lobe on the left, and then inferior lobar going to the inferior lobe on the left side. On the right side, we have an inferior lobe, we have a middle lobar, okay, and we have a superior lobar. So there's that extra middle lobar on the right side. The tertiary bronchi are going to be going to the segments. So that's why they're called segmental, okay? So the segments are color-coded for you here, and you're not going to learn segments. That's a little bit too much. If you're a respiratory therapist going into respiratory therapy, then you'll probably learn these segments. But just so you have an idea of why they're called segmental, that after that second split, those bronchi are going to move to those segments. Okay, so let's take a look at, so I want you guys to find number 1 and number 2, the primary and the secondary lobars on a diagram, but you're not responsible for finding the tertiary bronchi on a diagram, okay? So every time it splits, they get a little bit smaller in diameter. The tertiary bronchi, you have smooth muscle now around the smaller bronchi and the bronchioles. And for those of us who have asthma, I have asthma, when you have asthma, the smooth muscle of your bronchi and also your bronchioles, which are smaller, they contract, they constrict, and they're going to narrow the airway, which is going to cause, difficulty breathing and sometimes some wheezing. So that's due to the smooth muscle there. So let's take a look at another image here. So this is an actual human bronchial tree, and we can see the nice difference between the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. You see how it's much shorter, much straighter. This one's longer and more at an angle. And then this is that Karina, that split in this middle here. Here's our trachea, right? That split, and then we have our primary bronchi. All right, and this is another image of that Karina. Kind of went a little Karina crazy here. I'm going to post, if you've noticed here, there's a link to watch a bronchoscopy. I'll post this in the module so you can watch it. It's going to be an optional thing to watch. It's kind of interesting because you see this endoscope going into the lungs, and then the pathway will split. The person, manipulating it will have to pick a pathway, and then it'll split and split and split. And so you'll see like how many splits that you have going down into the lungs. And every time that you have a bifurcation or a split, you're going to get a smaller diameter structure. Okay. All right, this is a nice bronchogram of the bronchial tree. And lungs don't show up on an x-ray, right? Because x-rays are geared to pick up harder structures with more density. And so the lungs, since they are very delicate epithelial tissue, they don't bounce back those x-rays. So a healthy lung is going to be very, very basically invisible, black. When you see nodules or little spots, white spots that show up on your lung x-ray, that's bad news. That's something that's irregular and should not be there. All right. So your exam on this will include an histological slide of the trachea, and this is that. So the trachea is always going to have the esophagus posterior to that. So we have the trachea and then we have the esophagus. It should be pretty easy to tell the difference between the two because, again, the lumen of the trachea is going to be held open, right? So we have a nice big round lumen, and it's held open with tracheal cartilages. So this band of pink is going to be our tracheal cartilage. So if you remember what hyaline cartilage looks like, right? You have those chondrocytes within the lacuna a very smooth matrix in the background. If you zoom in on this, you should see hyaline cartilage. So you should be able to recognize, again, hyaline cartilage and call that our tracheal cartilage. If you zoom in on the very surface here, our epithelium, you should see respiratory epithelium. So again, it would be pseudostratified columnar cells, ciliated pseudostratified columnar cells with goblet cells. And that's very key in recognizing the trachea. Now, when we go and look at our esophagus, the esophagus is a very thick, right? Look at the wall, it's a lot thicker. All of this is smooth muscle. So it's a muscular tube compared to something that does not have that smooth muscle. And the lumen is collapsed, right? It only expands to allow the food to go down when you're swallowing. And look at this lining. This is a very thick lining. So if you remember from Unit 1, the esophagus had stratified squamous lining because the food is going to scrape it, and that stratified many layers of flat stratified cells is going to protect the underlying tissue. So you can lose some of those top cells, and and then the bottom will be protected. All right. What you also want to notice here is there's a thyroid gland. So attached to your trachea, there is a thyroid gland. We're going to look at this. This is the last lecture of the semester. We're going to talk about the endocrine system. But just notice here that this structure that looks kind of out of place, this is the thyroid gland. All right, so now we're looking at the bronchioles. So number 4 of your bronchial tree. The bronchioles are defined by having less than a 1 millimeter in diameter lumen. They are going to have some very large anatomical differences between the word bronchi and bronchiole. So the word bronchi are the larger segments of your airway. The bronchioles are smaller. And we have some anatomical differences, as I said. So the first one you might notice is that our light blue image here, which is the cartilage, is gone. So the bronchioles are no longer held open by cartilage. They lose that. They do have some elastin, so they are elastic. They also, inside the lining, remember we said that this has respiratory epithelium inside of it. Bronchioles do not. Now we have a lumen that is so small that if we had ciliated cells, tall pseudostratified cells, and mucus produced, it would completely obstruct the airway. So the epithelium is going to get smaller and lower to accommodate that diminishing diameter of the airway. Okay, so the bronchioles do not have cilia, nor do they have mucus producing cells. And any debris that was not caught in the mucus above that level must be removed by macrophages. So notice that, all of this part here will have mucus. So you can trap sort of these small particulates as you inhale. If it makes it past that area, then there's no more mucus to trap it. It's going to move into that terminal airways of our air sacs of our lungs. So the particulates will come down here into something called the alveolar sac. And here we have macrophages. So we have those immune cells that are phagocytose, debris. And so that's going to be your only sort of last resort to get rid of anything that comes into your lungs. All right, so let's take a look at our next slide here. So another histological slide on your exam from this chapter is being able to recognize the difference between a bronchus and a bronchiole, and to be able to recognize this lung tissue. So take a look at this image. All of this sort of middle space here, this is going to be our classic lung tissue. So lungs are very airy, right? So you see a lot of air spaces. The tissue is very thin, so a lot of this is going to be simple squamous epithelial cells. And then you're going to have structures that will jump out at you, these nice rounder structures here. So we can see immediately that this lumen is very large. We can also see hyaline cartilage. So that's your big clue. So if you see hyaline cartilage next to a lumen, you know that this is a bronchus, right? A bronchus, because it has those hyaline cartilage rings or plates still on. When you look at a bronchiole, you still have a lumen, an airway lumen, but you don't see any of that hyaline cartilage. Okay, so that's your big clue. Bronchus, there's hyaline cartilage right next to it. Bronchiole, there's no hyaline cartilage. All right, so let's look at this one. Is this a bronchus or a bronchiole? Okay, so if you're looking at it, here is a little strip of hyaline cartilage. Okay, here's another little area of hyaline cartilage. Here's another one. There's a little bit there. So this is a bronchus. Bronchus or bronchiole. Okay, I don't see any hyaline cartilage. I see some smooth muscle. So bronchioles will have smooth muscle, and then again, this smooth muscle can contract and diminish the diameter of our airway in asthma. So this is a bronchiole. All right. So now we're moving on down, number 5. Our bronchioles will end at something called a terminal bronchiole. The terminal bronchioles will branch into smaller respiratory bronchioles. So the respiratory bronchioles are called respiratory because you start to see these air sacs on that bronchiole. And then those respiratory bronchioles will end at an alveolar sac. So an alveolar sac is a collection of alveoli, right? So each individual circle here is called an alveolus. An alveolus is a singular form, right? This alveoli, which you see here, is plural because it's pointing to several alveoli. All right, so the process is terminal bronchioles, then respiratory bronchioles, and then finally to the alveolar sacs. All right, so we're going to take a look at our alveolar sacs. Okay, so this is a nice image because you can see how vascularized the alveolar sacs are. So you're breathing the air in, air comes down into our terminal portions of the lungs, these alveolar sacs. The alveoli are going to be covered, if you just look at one that's covered, it's covered with capillaries, right? Because this is where gas exchange happens. And the alveolar sacs, you have to have a lot of surface area here in order to exchange the amount of gases that you need to exchange. So having healthy alveolar sacs is key to breathing because all the tissue that the alveolar sac has is going to be covered with capillaries, and then that's where you have your gas exchange. If you damage or lose tissue of the alveolar sac, you lose that surface area that the blood supply can sort of attach to, and so you're going to lose the ability to diffuse gases across that alveolar sac. So the healthy alveolar sacs are critical for life. So let's take a look at what's inside the alveolus. So here's a picture of an alveolus. In your outline, alveoli are made of very thin, simple squamous cells. They're called type 1 cells. So everything in pink here, that's a type 1 cell. The alveolar sac is surrounded by capillaries for gas exchange, and this is called the respiratory epithelium. So this is kind of confusing because this junction between the capillary and the alveolus is also called respiratory epithelium. So it's made to be very, very close together. There's not a lot of extra matrix here. There's not a lot of fluid here. So our oxygen inside the alveolus can diffuse into the capillary. The carbon dioxide waste that our body makes is diffusing out into the alveolus. And that's basically how we exchange gases. It's based on the process of diffusion. So we're not pumping or moving with any energy, the gases. It's just through basic diffusion. Okay, so that's called the respiratory epithelium, or your book calls it also the respiratory membrane. All right, type 2 cells here in green create surfactant. So surfactant is a lipoprotein, and your alveoli are coated with this. So just what I usually do is make the analogy of a balloon. So if you have a balloon and you fill it with water, a water balloon, and then you dump out the water, the inside of the balloon is wet, right? So the sides of the balloon would stick to each other. You can imagine like if you have an internally wet balloon, that the balloon's going to collapse on each other because water has something called surface tension, and water molecules like to stick to each other. So if you have a small space like the inside of a balloon, then those water molecules are going to attract each other and it's going to collapse, and the two sides of the balloon or the sides of the balloon are going to stick together, right? Collapse the balloon. Now, if you take that wet balloon and you pour olive oil inside of it, and now you've coated that inside the balloon with olive oil, oil does not have that surface tension. So the oil is going to allow the two sides of the balloon, or this, the membrane of the balloon, to be open and not stick. And that's what surfactant does. So surfactant is a coating of a lipoprotein, lipo meaning fat, and it coats the inside of that alveolus. So it keeps the alveolus open by, and this is the key term, by lowering the surface tension inside, okay? So water has high surface tension, water wants to stick to each other, but if you add oil or this surfactant, it lowers the surface tension and the alveolus does not want to collapse. So it holds the alveolus open. This surfactant is so important that you can't breathe without it. And it's made in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And sometimes if babies are born before that 3rd trimester, before surfactant is made, the baby's lungs will not inflate. And so they have to get surfactant replacement therapy. They have to have surfactant put into their lungs so that their lungs will actually open up and allow air to go in. Lastly, letter D, we have resident macrophages. So there are our macrophages, our immune cells that are there so that anything that didn't get caught in the upper respiratory system, in the trachea, in those larger bronchi, if it makes it all the way to the alveolus, you do have some protection. You have macrophages present. All right. So the last thing before we end this segment is pneumonia. So there are two, I'm going to compare and contrast pneumonia and bronchitis. So pneumonia is a condition where your lungs are filling with fluid. And when people say your lungs are filling with fluid, they really mean the alveolus. So remember that this is an area for gas exchange. So this has to be air, and this has to be, your blood. Imagine the alveolus filling with fluid, pus from infection. This is going to impede the diffusion process of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So pneumonia is a very dangerous condition because it is a filling, the alveoli are filling with fluid, and it's going to stop the diffusion process of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it's very dangerous, it's life-threatening. Bronchitis, on the other hand, right, that's, if you just listen to the condition, bronchitis, it's an infection of the bronchi. So it's higher up in the lungs, and while bronchitis can be pretty nasty, you have the lumens kind of being clogged with mucus, because of the infection and that fluid there. You still can cough it up and it can be moved out of the lungs, and you still have, because it's a larger airway, you can still get air into the lungs and you can still breathe with bronchitis. But pneumonia is different, right? Pneumonia is a lower down, pneumonia infects the alveoli, and it can really stop the exchange of gases, so it can be very deadly. Can bronchitis lead to pneumonia? Of course, yes. So you want to treat your bronchitis. You don't want that infection to move down and become pneumonia. All right, so that's the difference between bronchitis and pneumonia, and we're going to stop here.